Welcome back to the second part. In the first part I showed how changing two parameters doubled FPS for me here in this scenery, getting more than 40 FPS now. I changed tessellation factor from max setting to low, and I changed lighting shadow draw distance from medium to low. In contrast to the first video, I modified the mesh resolution slider from 1 to 5 meter, which is enough for most scenery add-ons. This has no influence on FPS for me, but reduces loading times. Now we load a different scene from Charlie Bravo Alpha 7, Scar Creek in British Columbia, Canada. We now go to 0 uniform 0. This is landmark United States Forest Service airstrip in Idaho. When there is a Forest Service, a forest with lots of trees might not be far away. For Charlie Bravo Alpha 7 I use OPEX Pacific Northwest Scenery add-on. For 0 Uniform 0 I use OPEX Central Rocky Mountains. I have installed no other add-on which modifies scenery, clouds or anything else so far. As you will see in this series of videos, manufacturers can have a huge impact on the frame rate. As you can see, the FPS dropped from about 42 before to about 15 here with the same settings as before. What happened? This airport is surrounded by a huge forest with lots of trees, and what adds the landscape is flatter than at Charlie Bravo Alpha 7. There are no big mountains here. This has the result that the visibility distances where objects have to be drawn are much bigger. The reason for the drop in compared to V2 is that we have a much bigger drawing distance. Here it ends about in this area here. I'd zoom in so that you can see it better. Ends about here. In my tests I measured about a drawing distance of about 11 to 13 miles, which is more than twice the distance, the max distance available in V2. So there are more than 4 times the number of objects to be processed and drawn. Even here are some small areas on the backside of these hills, which helps a little bit, as we will see in the next example. adjusting the autogen vegetation density as available also in V2 is not really a solution for me. I will set that to normal to show you why. Prepar3D seems to process and to draw only objects which are visible from the actual camera view, and only objects that are within the camera view so objects which would be visible but are outside of the camera view, for example on the side, seems to be not processed. So mountains and objects from the side have not to be processed and not to be drawn. As you can see, I get a higher frame rate now, normally about 30 frames per second, but there might be a small drop here caused by the video capture software. You see there are not much trees remaining here near the runway, and also in bigger distances you see there is not much remaining from the dense forest. You only see single trees and isolated loose small groups of trees remaining. This is not acceptable for me. When there is a forest, I want to see one. There is a new slider in Prepar3D V4 called autogen draw distance. In V2 this setting was mixed with a level of detail radius slider, so there was no extra slider. But now you can find this extra slider here in V4. We set this one to medium and set the vegetation density back to extremely dense and see what happens. We have about 25 frames per second. This is the minimum I want to have. 30 is even better. The reasons for that I will explain in another video later. You see the dense trees are back, the dense forest is back. At higher altitudes, the FPS is increasing a little bit. You see here an graphics engine error, but this only happens when in slew mode here for demonstration. During normal flights I observe that very seldom. Here I can change the camera view to correct it, or I move the aircraft a little bit and the trees are back. You see the end of the tree drawing area here. This is about 6 miles now, and this is roughly equal to the result in Prepar3D V2 with maximal possible draw distance available by setting level of detail radius slider set to max there. When flying at higher altitudes you might observe an increase in FPS because The trees nearby, which are below, have not been drawn anymore because they are outside of the camera view. In these cases, the end of the drawing area might be apparent, and in this case you might increase the settings according to your needs here. In many cases I can use this setting when I do not have scenes with extreme density trees, like in forest areas. I can use this setting for most cases. Only when I have very dense tree areas or forests I have to use this one. And when you fly very high and observe the increase in FPS, you might even be able to set that higher. The same is true when you are in deep valleys, as we had in the first example in Charlie Bravo Alpha 7, but in this case you might not see any difference because the visibility distance is already very small. To increase this slider 1 point, you will get here a gain in tree draw distance of about 1 to 2 miles compared to this setting. Now we move to another scene I have prepared for you. We go to a small airstrip near Charlie Bravo Echo 8, Moose Lake in British Columbia, Canada. This is an area which is very flat, flatter than the area before, especially around the airstrip, and covered by a very dense forest. By the way, real forests are somewhat more dense, but I think how forests look in P3D is acceptable if density slider is set to max as demonstrated earlier. We get a drop in FPS back to about 23. If you are a little bit higher and more trees come inside, it drops to about 20. Flying very high, FPS increases to 24, but you clearly see the end of the tree drawing area now. In such a situation, if you try to vary various settings like level of detail ranges or autogen draw distance to reduce it more to the left side, of course you will get an even lower tree drawing range. Or autogen vegetation density, which leads to the same problems as demonstrated before. Or water detail, there you will not get a significant increase in FPS. But there is a simple solution. Here, in this very flat area you have no shadows, no terrain shadows. So if you disable terrain shadows, you will not lose graphic quality. Although there are no shadows have to be drawn, processing that seems to cost a lot of FPS. At the moment we have an FPS of about 20, and when I disable terrain shadows, I get an FPS of more than 40, and you see there is no loss in quality here. If you go higher, it even raises up to an FPS of 50. In this case, you might try to increase the autogen draw distance one or more steps here to the right. Here you get a very huge area where the trees are to be drawn, and you have still an acceptable FPS of about 28. As a general rule of thumb, for my hardware, I will set the autogen draw distance slider to high, which works for me for most sceneries. For very dense forests, I will set that to medium. When flying high, you might see a higher FPS because the former nearby trees are below us and outside of the view. Settings higher than high might be useful in this case, and end of tree drawing line is not so apparent then. In extreme cases, flat landscapes and dense forests, switching off terrain shadow is a quick and effective solution. Thanks for watching. See you.